The oppressive Georgia humidity clung to Margaret Chen's skin as she stepped out of her air-conditioned Honda Civic onto the cracked driveway of the Pemberton estate. Spanish moss draped from ancient oak trees like funeral shrouds, casting dancing shadows across the antebellum mansion's weathered facade. The estate sale had been advertised in the Savannah Morning News for 3 days, but Margaret had arrived early, hoping to find treasures before the weekend crowds descended. "How you here for the sale, honey?" called out a gravelly voice from the front porch. An elderly woman with steel-grey hair pulled into a tight bun emerged from behind a table laden with Depression-era glassware. "I'm Dolores Pemberton, and I'm afraid you're a bit early. We don't officially start until 9. Margaret glanced at her watch. 8:15. She offered her most charming smile, the one that had served her well in 20 years of antiquing. "I'm Margaret Chen from Midnight Treasures on Bull Street. I was hoping to take a quick peek before the crowds arrive. I specialize in historical pieces, and I heard the Pemberton family has some fascinating items." Dolores studied Margaret with shrewd eyes that had clearly seen decades of bargain hunters and dealers. After a moment, she nodded toward a side entrance. "Well, I suppose it wouldn't hurt. The really valuable stuff is upstairs in what used to be my great-uncle's study. He was obsessed with Savannah history, collected all sorts of old photographs and documents. Most of it's probably worthless, but you're welcome to look." Margaret's pulse quickened. Historical photographs were exactly what her clientele craved, especially wealthy tourists seeking authentic pieces of Savannah's storied past. She followed Dolores through a dimly lit hallway lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to track her movement through the shadows. The study occupied the entire 3rd floor, its walls lined with mahogany bookshelves that stretched from floor to ceiling. Dust motes danced in shafts of morning sunlight, streaming through tall windows draped with faded velvet curtains. The air smelled of old leather, tobacco, and something else, something stale and forgotten. "Take your time," Dolores said, gesturing toward several cardboard boxes stacked near an ornate writing desk. Most of those contain photographs and documents dating back to the 1800s. Uncle Harold was particularly fascinated with the old schools and institutions, said they held the real secrets of Savannah's past. Margaret waited until Dolores's footsteps faded down the staircase before opening the first box. Inside, she found carefully preserved daguerreotypes, tintypes, and early silver gelatin prints, each wrapped in acid-free tissue paper. The collection was remarkable: street scenes from the 1880s, formal portraits of prominent families, and several images of grand buildings she recognized as historic Savannah landmarks. She was examining a particularly striking photograph of Forsyth Park when her fingers encountered something unusual at the bottom of the 3rd box. Unlike the other images, this one was loose, unwrapped, and slightly larger than the rest. When she lifted it into the light, her breath caught in her throat. The photograph showed 3 children standing in what appeared to be a schoolyard, their faces turned toward the camera with bright, cheerful smiles. They wore the formal attire typical of the early 1900s, the 2 girls in white pinafores over dark dresses, the boy in knickers and a collared shirt. Behind them, Margaret could make out the blurred outline of a brick building and the distinctive drooping branches of live oak trees. But something about the image felt wrong. The children's smiles seemed too wide, too knowing for their apparent ages, and their eyes. Margaret held the photograph closer to the window, squinting in the morning light. The children's eyes appeared oddly dark, almost hollow. She reached into her leather satchel and retrieved a small magnifying glass, standard equipment for any serious antique dealer. Under magnification, the truth became horrifyingly clear. Where the children's eyes should have been, there were only empty black sockets, yet their smiles remained radiant, joyful, as if they were delighted by some wonderful secret only they could understand. Margaret's hands trembled as she flipped the photograph over. In faded brown ink, someone had written, "Whitmore Academy Spring Picnic, May 15th, 1901. Sarah, Thomas, and little Mary, forever young." A chill ran down Margaret's spine, despite the warm Georgia morning. She had lived in Savannah for 15 years, had researched countless historical properties and institutions, but she had never heard of Whitmore Academy. The photograph felt ice-cold against her fingers, and she could have sworn she heard the faint sound of children's laughter echoing from somewhere deep within the old mansion. "Find anything interesting?" Dolores's voice made Margaret jump. The older woman had returned silently, her footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rug. Margaret held up the photograph, careful to keep the front facing away from Dolores. "This one caught my attention. Do Do you know anything about Whitmore Academy? Dolores's face went pale, and she took an involuntary step backward. Where did you find that? In the third box at the bottom. Is there something wrong? I haven't seen that photograph in probably 40 years. Uncle Harold kept it hidden away, said it gave him nightmares. Dolores wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking far older than her 70-something years. Whitmore Academy was before my time, but the old-timers used to whisper about it. Something terrible happened there back in 1901. 3 children went missing during a school picnic, never found. The academy closed within a year. Margaret felt her antique dealer instincts warring with a growing sense of unease. The photograph was clearly valuable, both historically and monetarily, but holding it made her skin crawl. What happened to the children? Nobody knows for sure. Some said they wandered into the Ogeechee River and drowned. Others claimed they were taken by strangers passing through town. But the strangest part, Dolores paused, glancing nervously at the photograph in Margaret's hands. Some folks swear they still see those children playing in the old schoolyard on misty mornings. 3 little figures skipping through the ruins, laughing like they don't have a care in the world. Margaret made her decision. How much do you want for it? Take it, Dolores said quickly. Take it and don't bring it back. Uncle Harold always said that photograph was cursed, that it brought nothing but trouble to anyone who owned it. Maybe you can find a way to put those poor children to rest. As Margaret carefully wrapped the photograph in tissue paper and placed it in her satchel, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was making a terrible mistake. But her curiosity was stronger than her fear, and she needed to know more about Sarah, Thomas, and little Mary. Outside, storm clouds were gathering over Savannah's historic district, and the Spanish moss swayed ominously in the rising wind. Margaret drove back to her shop with the photograph beside her on the passenger seat, unaware that she was being followed by 3 small shadows that danced playfully between the oak trees lining the road. Margaret's antique shop occupied the ground floor of a narrow 3-story building on Bull Street, its windows filled with carefully arranged displays of vintage jewelry, Civil War memorabilia, and ornate furniture that drew tourists like moths to flame. She had named it Midnight Treasures, partly for the mystique, and partly because she often found herself working late into the night, researching the histories of her more unusual acquisitions. The brass bell above the door chimed as she entered, but the familiar sound felt different today, more resonant, almost mournful. Margaret shrugged off the sensation and made her way to the back office, a cramped space lined with reference books, auction catalogues, and filing cabinets containing decades of provenance documentation. She placed the photograph on her desk under the bright halogen lamp she used for examining delicate items. In the harsh light, the image looked even more disturbing than it had in the Pemberton mansion. The children's empty eye sockets seemed to stare directly at her, and their smiles appeared frozen in an expression of terrible joy. Margaret opened her laptop and began searching for information about Whitmore Academy. The initial results were frustratingly sparse. A few mentions in genealogy websites, some references in obscure historical journals, but nothing substantial. It was as if someone had deliberately erased the school from Savannah's official history. After an hour of fruitless searching, she decided to try a different approach. Margaret picked up her phone and dialed the number for the Georgia Historical Society, housed in the magnificent Hodgson Hall just a few blocks away. Historical Society, this is Jennifer speaking. Hi Jennifer, this is Margaret Chen from Midnight Treasures. I'm researching a local institution called Whitmore Academy, and I was hoping you might have some records. There was a pause before Jennifer responded, her voice noticeably cooler. Whitmore Academy, that's an unusual request. May I ask what your interest is? Margaret sensed reluctance in the woman's tone. I've acquired a photograph that appears to be connected to the school, dated 1901. I'm trying to establish its provenance for a client. Another pause, longer this time. I'll need to check with our head archivist, Dr. Rutherford. He's the expert on Savannah's educational institutions. Can you hold? While waiting, Margaret found herself staring at the photograph. Was it her imagination, or had one of the children shifted slightly? She blinked hard and looked again. The image remained the same, but she could have sworn the little girl on the left had tilted her head. Miss Chen? Jennifer's voice crackled through the phone. Dr. Rutherford says he can meet with you this afternoon at 3 o'clock. He asks that you bring the photograph with you. Margaret agreed and hung up, feeling both relieved and apprehensive. She had dealt with Dr. James Rutherford before, a distinguished African-American historian in his 60s who had written several definitive books on Savannah's antebellum period. He was thorough, discreet, and had an uncanny ability to uncover information that others missed. The remainder of the morning passed uneventfully as Margaret helped customers and continued her online research. But as the afternoon approached, she noticed increasingly strange occurrences in the shop. The temperature seemed to drop near her desk, despite the humid warmth outside. Several customers commented on hearing children's laughter coming from the back office, though Margaret heard nothing. Most unsettling of all, when she glanced at the photograph, she sometimes caught movement in her peripheral vision, as if the children were playing just beyond the frame. At 2:30, Margaret locked the shop and walked the few blocks to Hodgson Hall. The imposing Romanesque Revival building had served as the home of the Georgia Historical Society since 1876, its red brick facade and distinctive towers making it one of Savannah's most recognizable landmarks. Dr. Rutherford was waiting in the main reading room, a tall, elegant man with silver hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He stood as Margaret approached, extending his hand in greeting. "Ms. Chen, thank you for coming. I understand you've discovered something related to Whitmore Academy." His voice carried the cultured accent of old Savannah, tinged with something that might have been concern. Margaret carefully removed the photograph from her satchel and placed it on the table. Dr. Rutherford's reaction was immediate and telling. His face went ashen, and he took an involuntary step backward. "Dear God," he whispered, "I haven't seen this in over 30 years. "You've seen it before?" Dr. Rutherford nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the photograph. "This exact image was brought to me in 1992 by an elderly woman named Constance Whitmore. She claimed to be the last surviving member of the family that founded the academy. She wanted me to research what happened to those children." Margaret leaned forward. "And what did you find?" "More than I bargained for." "Doctor." Rutherford gestured for her to follow him to a private study room. The official story was that 3 students, Sarah Blackwood, Thomas Henley, and Mary Catherine Morrison, disappeared during a spring picnic on May 15, 1901. The Academy launched a massive search, involving the entire community, but no trace of the children was ever found. He opened a thick file folder and spread several documents across the table. "But I discovered something else. In the weeks following the disappearance, several teachers and staff members left Whitmore Academy abruptly. The school's enrollment plummeted, and parents began withdrawing their children. By the spring of 1902, the academy was forced to close permanently." Margaret studied the documents, newspaper clippings, school records, and what appeared to be correspondence between faculty members. "What caused the exodus?" "Fear," Dr. Rutherford said simply. "I found personal letters and diary entries describing strange occurrences after the children vanished. Teachers reported seeing small figures playing in the schoolyard at night. Several mentioned hearing children's voices coming from empty classrooms. One teacher, a woman named Elena Chen, wrote extensively about her experiences." Margaret's blood ran cold. "Chen, that's my surname." Dr. Rutherford studied her face carefully. "I thought there might be a connection." Elena Chen was a young teacher at Whitmore Academy. In 1901, according to her letters, she suspected that the children's disappearance wasn't accidental. She believed someone at the school was responsible. What happened to her? She died in 1903, supposedly of consumption, but her final letters suggest she was on the verge of exposing whoever was behind the children's disappearance. Dr. Rutherford pulled out a faded photograph of a young Asian woman in Victorian dress. "This is Elena Chen. The resemblance is quite striking." Margaret stared at the photograph of her ancestor, feeling as if puzzle pieces were falling into place. "Is that why you agreed to meet with me?" "Partly, but also because of what happened to the previous owners of that photograph you're carrying." Dr. Rutherford's expression grew grave. "The Whitmore woman who brought it to me in 1992 died in a house fire 2 weeks later. The photograph survived somehow and found its way to a private collector in Atlanta. He lasted 3 months before suffering a fatal heart attack. The pattern has repeated itself 6 times over the past 30 years. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "You're saying the photograph is cursed?" "I'm saying that photograph has been trying to tell someone's story for over a century, and it won't rest until that story is heard." "Doctor." Rutherford gathered the documents back into his file. "Elena Chen believed the children were murdered, Miss Chen. She died trying to prove it. Perhaps it's time someone finished what she started." As if in response to his words, the lights in the study room flickered, and Margaret could have sworn she heard the distant sound of children laughing, echoing through the halls of Hodgson Hall. The photograph on the table seemed to grow colder, and when she looked at it, She was certain that all three children were now looking directly at her with their hollow, eyeless sockets. Dr. Rutherford noticed her expression and nodded gravely. They know you're listening now. The question is, are you prepared for what they're going to show you? Margaret drove home through Savannah's historic district as evening shadows lengthened across the cobblestone streets. Her Victorian cottage on Charlton Street sat nestled between towering magnolia trees, their waxy white blossoms filling the air with sweet perfume that usually brought her comfort. Tonight, however, the familiar scent seemed cloying, almost funeral-like. She parked in the narrow driveway and sat for a moment, staring at the photograph that lay on the passenger seat. Even in the fading daylight, she could see the children's hollow eye sockets and their impossibly bright smiles. Dr. Rutherford's words echoed in her mind. They know you're listening now. As she walked up the front steps, Margaret noticed that her porch light wasn't working, though she was certain it had been functioning that morning. The key stuck in the lock, requiring several attempts before the door finally opened with a reluctant creak. Inside, the cottage felt different, colder despite the warm evening, and filled with an expectant silence that made her skin crawl. Margaret placed the photograph on her dining room table and poured herself a glass of wine, hoping the alcohol might steady her nerves. She had lived alone for the past 5 years since her divorce and usually enjoyed the solitude. But tonight, the empty rooms felt oppressive, as if invisible eyes were watching her every move. She tried to distract herself by researching Elena Chen on her laptop, but the wireless connection kept dropping and her screen flickered intermittently. After the third system crash, Margaret closed the laptop in frustration and decided to take a hot bath before bed. The bathroom was at the rear of the house, accessible through her bedroom. As she filled the clawfoot tub with steaming water, Margaret caught movement in her peripheral vision. She turned quickly but saw only her reflection in the antique mirror above the vanity. Yet something was wrong with the reflection. For just a moment it seemed as if 3 small figures had been standing behind her. Margaret shook her head, attributing the vision to stress and exhaustion. But as she sank into the hot water, the temperature suddenly plummeted, as if someone had dumped ice into the tub. Her breath came in visible puffs, and frost began forming on the bathroom tiles. Then she heard it, the unmistakable sound of children's laughter coming from somewhere inside the house. Margaret bolted upright, water sloshing over the sides of the tub. The laughter was high and musical, full of innocent joy, but there was something underneath it that made her blood run cold. She wrapped herself in a towel and crept toward the bedroom door, her bare feet numb on the suddenly freezing floor. "Hello?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is someone there?" The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete that Margaret could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. She waited, counting the seconds, before cautiously opening the bedroom door. The hallway stretched before her, illuminated only by moonlight streaming through the front windows. Everything appeared normal, but the air itself seemed to shimmer, as if she were looking through water. Margaret took a tentative step forward, then another, drawn by a compulsion she couldn't explain. As she entered the living room, Margaret saw them. 3 children stood near the fireplace, their backs to her, dressed in the same period clothing from the photograph. They were perfectly still, like mannequins arranged in a museum display. The little girl on the left wore a white pinafore, her dark hair pulled back with a ribbon. The boy in the center had his hands clasped behind his back, his knickers and collared shirt immaculate, despite being over a century old. The smallest girl on the right couldn't have been more than 6 years old, her tiny frame almost lost in her formal dress. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. "Sarah, Thomas, Mary." As if her words had broken a spell, all 3 children turned to face her in perfect unison. Where their eyes should have been, Margaret saw only empty blackness. Not the hollow sockets from the photograph, but deep voids that seemed to absorb light itself. Yet their smiles remained radiant, filled with a joy that was somehow more terrifying than any expression of anger or malice. The smallest girl, Mary, stepped forward and opened her mouth as if to speak. Instead of words, a sound emerged that was like wind through dead leaves, or the whisper of silk being torn. Margaret couldn't understand the words, but she felt their meaning in her bones. "Help us." Thomas, the boy, raised his hand and pointed toward the dining room where the photograph lay. His gesture was accompanied by the same ethereal whisper, and Margaret heard a name that made her knees buckle: Eleanor. The oldest girl, Sarah, moved with fluid grace to stand beside her companions. When she spoke, her voice was like an echo from the bottom of a well. She tried to save us. Now you must finish what she started. Margaret wanted to run, wanted to flee the house and never return, but her feet seemed rooted to the floor. The children's eyeless gaze held her captive, and she realized with growing horror that they weren't malevolent spirits seeking revenge. They were lost, confused, and desperately seeking justice for a crime that had gone unpunished for over a century. "What happened to you?" Margaret managed to whisper. The three children exchanged glances, communicating in ways that transcended sound or gesture. Then Sarah stepped closer, her hollow sockets focusing directly on Margaret's face. "We trusted him," she said, her voice carrying the weight of profound betrayal. "He said he wanted to help us see better, to see the truth. He took our eyes first, then our breath, then our lives. But we couldn't rest, couldn't move on, because no one believed what really happened." Thomas nodded, his small fist clenched at his side. "They buried us in the dark place under the school where no one would find us. But we remained, watching, waiting for someone who would listen." Little Mary approached Margaret with the fearless curiosity of a child. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. "Elena saw the truth. She knew what he did to us, but they made her sick, made her die before she could tell anyone." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. Who did this to you?" "The one with kind eyes and gentle hands," Sarah replied. "The one everyone trusted with their children. Dr. Aldrich Morrison." The name hit Margaret like a physical blow. Morrison, the same surname as little Mary. "He killed his own daughter." "Not his daughter," Thomas corrected. "His experiment. We were all his experiments. He told us he was studying the windows to the soul, that removing our eyes would help him understand how sight worked. He promised it wouldn't hurt, that he would give us better eyes afterward." Margaret's stomach churned with revulsion. "Dear God! But Elena discovered his journal," Sarah continued. "She found where he buried us, found proof of what he had done. That's why they had to silence her too." The children began to fade as dawn light crept through the windows, their forms becoming translucent and wavering. But their voices remained clear. "Find the journal. Find our bones. Give us the justice Elena couldn't." As the last traces of their presence disappeared, Margaret found herself alone in her living room, shivering in her damp towel. The photograph on the dining room table was now face down, though she was certain she had left it face up. When she turned it over, she gasped. The image had changed. The three children were no longer smiling at the camera. Instead, they stood with their backs turned, walking away toward the shadows of the old schoolyard. And written across the bottom in fresh ink were three words that made Margaret's blood run cold. "Find Dr. Morrison." Margaret barely slept that night, haunted by the memory of three eyeless children and their plea for justice. When morning finally came, she found herself staring at the transformed photograph over her coffee, studying every detail of the new image. The children's backs were turned now, walking toward what appeared to be a brick building partially obscured by Spanish moss and shadows. By 8 o'clock, she was dressed and ready to return to the Georgia Historical Society. Dr. Rutherford had said to call if she needed access to restricted archives, and after what she had witnessed, Margaret knew she needed to dig deeper into Dr. Morrison's background. The morning air was thick with humidity and the promise of afternoon thunderstorms. As Margaret walked down Bull Street, she noticed that several people glanced at her with curious expressions, as if she carried some invisible mark. A young mother pushing a stroller crossed to the other side of the street when she saw Margaret approaching, and an elderly man sitting on a park bench made the sign of the cross as she passed. At Hodgson Hall, the receptionist looked uncomfortable when Margaret asked for Dr. Rutherford. "He's in the restricted archives this morning," Jennifer said, avoiding eye contact. "He asked me to send you down if you came by, basement level through the security door." Margaret had never been in the Historical Society's restricted archives before. The basement level was accessed by a narrow staircase that seemed to descend far deeper than the building's ground floor footprint would suggest. The walls were lined with ancient brick, and the air smelled of old paper, leather bindings, and something else. Something that reminded her of the metallic scent that lingered after a violent thunderstorm. Dr. Rutherford was waiting in a small reading room lined with climate-controlled storage cabinets. He looked as if he hadn't slept either, his usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "Ms. Chen," he said, rising to greet her. "I take it you had visitors last night?" Margaret stared at him in surprise. "How did you know?" "Because I had the same experience 30 years ago, the last time someone brought me that photograph. The children came to me in my study at home, told me the same story about Dr. Morrison." He gestured toward a table covered with boxes and files. "I've been here since 5 this morning, pulling everything I could find about Aldrich Morrison and Whitmore Academy." Margaret approached the table, noting that several of the files were marked with red tape, restricted access materials that required special permission to view. "What did you discover?" "More than I expected, and all of it deeply disturbing." Dr. Rutherford opened the first file, revealing newspaper clippings from 1901. Dr. Aldrich Morrison was considered one of Savannah's most prominent physicians. He specialized in diseases of the eye and had a particular interest in what he called ocular psychology, the study of how vision affected mental and emotional development. Margaret examined a newspaper photograph showing a distinguished man in his 40s with kind eyes and a gentle smile, exactly as the children had described him. He looked so normal, so trustworthy. That's what made him so dangerous. Morrison had access to children through his position as the school physician at Whitmore Academy. Parents considered it an honor to have their children examined by him. Dr. Rutherford pulled out a leather-bound journal. "This is Morrison's personal diary, donated to our archives in 1952 by his estate. Most of it deals with routine medical cases, but there are some entries." He opened the journal to a page marked with a yellow sticky note. Margaret read the entry dated April 12, 1901. "The Blackwood girl shows remarkable resilience to the preparatory treatments. Her ocular responses remain strong even after the initial procedures. I believe she will provide excellent data for the advanced experiments. The Morrison child continues to exhibit perfect trust as expected. The Henley boy shows some resistance, but nothing that cannot be overcome with proper persuasion." Margaret's hands trembled as she read. Dear God, he was planning it weeks in advance. "It gets worse." Dr. Rutherford turned several pages. "Here's the entry from May 16th, the day after the children disappeared." Margaret read the spidery handwriting aloud. The procedures went flawlessly. All 3 subjects remained conscious throughout the ocular extractions, providing valuable data on pain response and psychological adaptation. The Blackwood girl demonstrated the most interesting reactions, maintaining speech patterns even after complete bilateral enucleation. Must remember to record audio observations for future reference. Disposal in the sub-basement chamber proceeded without complications. School administration shows appropriate concern but no suspicion. Margaret felt bile rising in her throat. He tortured them while they were still alive. And that's not the worst part. Dr. Rutherford produced another file, this one containing architectural drawings. "I found the original blueprints for Whitmore Academy. There was a sub-basement level that was sealed off and removed from later building plans. Morrison had a private laboratory down there, supposedly for conducting research on preserved specimens. The architectural drawings showed a complex underground chamber system beneath the main academy building. One room was marked as a surgical theater, another as specimen storage, and a third simply labeled disposal. The children's bodies are still down there," Margaret whispered. "Almost certainly, and according to Elena Chen's letters, she discovered Morrison's laboratory shortly before her death." Dr. Rutherford pulled out a bundle of handwritten pages tied with a faded ribbon. "These are Elena's personal correspondence with her sister in San Francisco. She wrote that she had found physical evidence of Morrison's crimes and planned to present it to the authorities." Margaret untied the ribbon with shaking fingers and read Eleanor's final letter, dated October 15, 1903. "Dearest sister, I fear this may be my final correspondence. Dr. Morrison has discovered that I know about the children. He has begun treating me for a mysterious illness that grows worse with each of his visits. I have hidden the evidence where he cannot find it, along with detailed documentation of his activities. If something happens to me, look for the truth in the place where knowledge sleeps with the dead." Dr. Rutherford leaned forward. "That last phrase has puzzled me for decades. Where knowledge sleeps with the dead." Margaret studied the letter again, focusing on Elena's careful handwriting. She was a teacher. Where would a teacher hide something important? In the school, obviously, but Whitmore Academy was demolished in 1925. Margaret felt a sudden inspiration. Not in the school, in a library. Libraries are where knowledge sleeps, and if there were bodies buried underneath. She looked up at Dr. Rutherford with growing excitement. The Carnegie Library. It was built in 1906, just 3 years after Elena's death, and it's only 2 blocks from where Whitmore Academy used to stand. Dr. Rutherford's eyes widened. The Carnegie Library was built on the former site of Whitmore Academy's athletic fields. If Elena hid evidence there before the construction began, Margaret was already gathering the files and photographs. "We need to search the library's foundation. especially any areas that might have been sealed during construction. As they prepared to leave the archives, Margaret noticed that the photograph had changed again. The three children were no longer walking away from the camera. Now they stood facing forward, their empty sockets seeming to look directly at her, and their smiles had returned. But these weren't the eerily joyful expressions from the original image. These smiles were different, hopeful, grateful, and filled with an anticipation that made Margaret's heart race. The children knew she was getting closer to the truth, and somewhere in the darkness, beneath Savannah's streets, Dr. Morrison's victims were waiting for their long-delayed justice. The Live Oak Public Library, formerly known as the Carnegie Library, stood like a temple to knowledge on the corner of Bull and Oglethorpe Streets. Built in 1906, with funds from philanthropist Andrew Carnegie, the neoclassical building had served Savannah's literary needs for over a century. Its imposing columns and granite facade gave no hint of the dark secrets that might lie buried beneath its foundation. Margaret and Dr. Rutherford approached the library's main entrance as storm clouds gathered overhead. The afternoon air was electric with the promise of rain, and Margaret noticed that the Spanish moss hanging from the surrounding oak trees seemed to sway despite the absence of any breeze. "I called ahead and spoke with the head librarian," Dr. Rutherford said as they climbed the steps. "Sandra Westbrook has been here for 25 years. If anyone knows about unusual features in the building's construction, it would be her." The library's interior was hushed and cool, filled with the comforting scent of old books and polished wood. Tall windows cast rectangles of grey light across reading tables, where a few patrons sat absorbed in their research. Margaret felt the familiar peace that libraries had always brought her, but today there was an undercurrent of tension, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Sandra Westbrook emerged from behind the circulation desk, a woman in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair and intelligent blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She wore a concerned expression as she approached them. "Dr. Rutherford, I have to say your phone call was quite intriguing. Questions about sealed areas in our foundation aren't exactly routine." She glanced at Margaret with curiosity. "I understand you're researching some aspect of the building's history." Margaret chose her words carefully. "We're investigating the possibility that artifacts or documents might have been buried on this site before the library's construction in 1906, specifically items related to Whitmore Academy." Sandra's reaction was immediate and telling. Her face paled, and she glanced nervously around the reading room, as if checking to make sure no one was listening. "Perhaps we should discuss this in my office." She led them through a maze of stacks to a small office tucked away in the building's rear corner. The walls were lined with framed photographs documenting the library's construction and early years. Sandra closed the door behind them and gestured for Margaret and Dr. Rutherford to sit. "I've been head librarian here for 25 years, Sandra began, settling behind her desk. "In that time, I've heard stories about this place that most people would dismiss as nonsense. But when you work alone in an old building, especially during the night shifts, you notice things." Margaret leaned forward. "What kind of things?" "Sounds, mostly. Footsteps in areas where no one should be walking. Children's laughter coming from the basement storage areas. And the cold spots. There are sections of this building that remain inexplicably cold, regardless of the season or heating system." Dr. Rutherford pulled out the architectural drawings from Whitmore Academy. "Do you have the original construction plans for the library? We're particularly interested in the foundation work and any sealed areas." Sandra nodded and retrieved a large flat file from a cabinet behind her desk. "These are copies of the original blueprints from 1906. She spread them across her desk alongside Dr. Rutherford's academy plans. "There's something unusual about the foundation that's puzzled building inspectors for decades." Margaret studied the library blueprints, comparing them to the academy's underground layout. The library's foundation showed several chambers that were sealed with concrete during construction, chambers that aligned almost perfectly with the academy's sub-basement laboratory system. "According to the construction records," Sandra continued, "the workers encountered pre-existing underground structures when they began excavating. Instead of removing them, the builders simply sealed them off and built the foundation around them. The official explanation was that it was more cost-effective than excavation." Dr. Rutherford traced the sealed areas with his finger. "These chambers would have been part of Morrison's laboratory complex. Elena Chen might have hidden evidence down there before the construction began." Sandra looked confused. "Who's Elena Chen, and what evidence?" Margaret made a decision. If they were going to gain access to the sealed areas, Sandra needed to understand the gravity of the situation. In 1901, 3 children were murdered at Whitmore Academy by a doctor conducting illegal medical experiments. A teacher named Elena Chen discovered evidence of the crimes, but died before she could present it to authorities. We believe she hid that evidence in the underground chambers before the library was built. Sandra stared at them in shock. "You're saying there are murder victims buried under my library?" "We believe so," Dr. Rutherford said gently, "and we think those children's spirits have been trying to lead someone to the truth for over a century." As if summoned by his words, the temperature in the office dropped dramatically. Margaret's breath became visible, and frost began forming on the windows despite the warm afternoon outside. Sandra gasped and pointed behind Margaret's chair. Margaret turned to see 3 familiar figures standing near the office door. Sarah, Thomas, and little Mary appeared more solid than they had the night before, their period clothing detailed and realistic, except for the terrible emptiness where their eyes should have been. They stood perfectly still, watching the adults with expressions of patient hope. Sandra gripped her desk, her knuckles white. "Dear God, what are they?" "The children we told you about," Margaret said softly. "Sarah Blackwood, Thomas Henley, and Mary Morrison." Little Mary stepped forward, her small form moving with ethereal grace. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades of waiting. "The truth lies beneath your feet, where the bad man hid his shame." Elena kept her promise. She preserved what he tried to destroy. Thomas pointed downward, toward the library's foundation, 3 doors down from the stairs that go nowhere, behind the wall that weeps in winter. Sarah's hollow gaze fixed on Sandra. "You have walked above our bones every day for 25 years. You have heard our voices calling from the dark places. Will you help us find the light?" Sandra sat in stunned silence for a long moment before slowly nodding. "There are maintenance tunnels that lead to the sealed areas. I've always avoided them because of the strange sounds and the cold. But," she looked at the 3 children with a mixture of fear and compassion. "If you're really down there, if someone hurt you, then yes, I'll help you find justice." The spirits smiled, genuinely smiled, for the first time since Margaret had encountered them. The terrible joy was gone, replaced by gratitude and hope. As Sandra reached for the maintenance keys hanging behind her desk, the children began to fade, but their voices remained clear. "Follow the weeping wall. Elena waits where knowledge sleeps with the dead." Thunder rumbled overhead as Sandra led Margaret and Dr. Rutherford toward the library's basement, unaware that they were about to disturb a crime scene that had remained untouched for over a century. In the gathering storm, Savannah's shadows seemed to whisper of secrets finally coming to light, and justice long delayed but not denied. The basement of the Carnegie Library was a labyrinth of narrow corridors lined with heating pipes, electrical conduits, and storage rooms filled with decades of archived materials. Sandra led the way with a heavy flashlight, her keys jangling nervously as she navigated passages that most library patrons never knew existed. "The maintenance tunnels are through here," she said, stopping before a heavy steel door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." "I've only been down there a handful of times, and never for very long. The temperature drops at least 20 degrees, and there's this sound, like breathing, coming from the walls." Dr. Rutherford checked his own flashlight and adjusted the digital camera hanging around his neck. "We need to document everything we find. If we're right about Elena Chen hiding evidence down here, it could finally provide the proof needed to expose Morrison's crimes." Margaret carried the photograph in a protective sleeve, along with a small digital recorder. As Sandra unlocked the maintenance door, Margaret noticed that the image had changed again. The 3 children now stood together holding hands, their faces turned toward what appeared to be a staircase descending into darkness. The maintenance tunnel beyond the door was cramped and oppressive, with concrete walls that wept moisture despite the building's modern climate control system. Their footsteps echoed strangely, as if the sound was being absorbed and reflected back from impossible distances. The air smelled of damp earth and something else, something sweet and cloying that made Margaret think of funeral flowers. "There," Sandra whispered, pointing ahead to where the tunnel branched into 3 directions. "The left passage leads to the old storm drainage system. The middle goes to the foundation supports. And the right," she hesitated. "The right tunnel has been sealed since I started working here. That's where the weeping wall is." They followed the right-hand passage for about 50 feet before encountering a brick wall that had obviously been added years after the original construction. The newer bricks were a slightly different color, and moisture seeped through the mortar joints, creating dark stains that ran down the wall like tears. "This has to be it," Dr. Rutherford said, examining the wall with his flashlight. According to the blueprints, there should be a chamber about 10 feet beyond this barrier. Margaret approached the wall and placed her hand against the damp bricks. The moment her palm made contact, the temperature plummeted and her breath came in visible puffs. She could have sworn she felt a pulse beneath her hand, as if something was alive on the other side. "There's a loose section here," Sandra observed, kneeling near the base of the wall. "These bricks aren't properly mortared. It's almost as if someone created a deliberate access point." Working together, they carefully removed the loose bricks, revealing a narrow opening just large enough for a person to crawl through. The air that flowed from the gap was Arctic cold and carried the unmistakable scent of old death. Dr. Rutherford shone his flashlight through the opening, illuminating a small chamber beyond. "I can see something in there. It looks like furniture and books." Margaret volunteered to go first, ignoring the protests of her companions. The opening was tight, but she managed to squeeze through into the hidden chamber. As she stood and swept her flashlight around the space, she gasped at what she discovered. The chamber was a perfectly preserved office from 1903, complete with a wooden desk, filing cabinets, and shelves lined with books and journals. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, but the dry conditions had prevented decay. On the desk sat an ornate oil lamp, several fountain pens, and a stack of papers held down by a glass paperweight. "Elena's hiding place," Margaret breathed. She created a time capsule. Dr. Rutherford and Sandra joined her in the chamber, their flashlights revealing the extent of Elena's desperate effort to preserve evidence. The walls were lined with photographs, documents, and what appeared to be medical specimens preserved in glass jars. Sandra pointed to a corner where 3 small forms lay covered by white sheets. "Dear God, are those—" Margaret approached the covered forms with trembling hands. When she pulled back the nearest sheet, she revealed the skeletal remains of a child dressed in a decaying pinafore. The skull showed clear evidence of trauma around the eye sockets, and nearby lay a collection of surgical instruments stained with rust and something darker. "Sarah Blackwood," Margaret whispered, reading a small placard that Elena had placed beside the remains. The other 2 sheets covered Thomas Henley and Mary Morrison, their bones bearing similar evidence of Morrison's surgical horrors. Dr. Rutherford was examining the documents on the desk. "Look at this. Elena documented everything. She has Morrison's complete surgical notes, photographs of the children before and after the procedures, and witness statements from other Academy staff who suspected something was wrong." One photograph in particular caught Margaret's attention. It showed Dr. Morrison in his laboratory, smiling as he held up what appeared to be preserved human eyes in a glass jar. Behind him, barely visible in the shadows, 3 small figures sat strapped to surgical tables. Sandra found a leather-bound journal filled with Elena's meticulous handwriting. She recorded dates, times, and detailed descriptions of Morrison's activities. She even has correspondence between Morrison and colleagues discussing the advancement of ocular science through experimental procedures. Margaret picked up a letter written in Morrison's own hand, addressed to a colleague at Johns Hopkins University. "The pediatric subjects have provided invaluable data on pain tolerance and visual processing during conscious enucleation. I believe we are on the verge of revolutionary discoveries that will advance medical science immeasurably." As they gathered the evidence, the chamber began to fill with a soft, golden light that seemed to emanate from the very air itself. The 3 children appeared one final time, but now they looked different. Their hollow eye sockets had been replaced by gentle, peaceful expressions, and they wore flowing white garments instead of their period clothing. Sarah stepped forward and spoke, her voice now clear and musical. "Thank you for hearing us. Thank you for believing. Elena's sacrifice was not in vain." Thomas smiled at Dr. Rutherford. "The truth will set us free, just as Elena promised." Little Mary approached Margaret and reached out as if to touch her face. "You carry Elena's blood and her courage. She would be proud." As the children began to fade into the golden light, their voices joined together in a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "We can rest now. Justice will come." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face as she watched the spirits finally find peace. After more than a century of waiting, the truth had been uncovered, and the children could move on to whatever lay beyond. But their work wasn't finished yet. Dr. Morrison's crimes had been hidden for too long, and his descendants were still alive, still benefiting from the wealth and prestige built on the bones of murdered children. The evidence Elena had preserved would finally bring justice, but Margaret suspected that some people would kill to keep these secrets buried. As thunder crashed overhead and rain began to fall on Savannah's historic streets, Margaret gathered Elena's documents and prepared to face whatever consequences came with exposing the truth. The children were at peace, but their story was just beginning to be told. The Savannah Police Department's Detective Bureau occupied a modern building that stood in stark contrast to the historic district surrounding it. Detective Rosa Santos, a 15-year veteran with the department, stared at the evidence spread across her desk with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. The skeletal remains, surgical instruments, and Elena Chen's meticulously preserved documentation painted a picture of crimes so horrific that she had initially doubted their authenticity. "You're absolutely certain about the dating on these materials?" Detective Santos asked Dr. Rutherford, who sat across from her desk alongside Margaret and Sandra. It was Monday morning, 3 days after their discovery in the library's foundation, and Santos had spent the weekend consulting with forensic experts and historians. "The carbon dating confirms that the remains are consistent with deaths occurring between 1900 and 1905, Dr. Rutherford replied. "The paper, ink, and photographic processes used in Elena Chen's documentation are all authentic to the period. There's no question that these murders took place exactly as described." Santos picked up one of Morrison's surgical notes, shaking her head in disgust. 3 children tortured and killed by their school physician, and no one suspected anything? Morrison was a pillar of the community, Margaret explained. He was wealthy, respected, and had connections to some of Savannah's most prominent families. Elena Chen was a young immigrant teacher with no social standing. Who would have believed her accusations? "Speaking of Morrison's family connections," Santos said, opening a thick folder, "I've been researching his descendants. The Morrison family has remained prominent in Savannah society for over a century. Dr. Aldrich Morrison's great-great-grandson, Judge William Morrison, currently sits on the Georgia State Supreme Court. His nephew, Dr. Richard Morrison, runs the Morrison Medical Foundation, one of the largest charitable organizations in the Southeast." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "They're still here, still benefiting from blood money." "There's more," Santos continued. "The Morrison family owns significant real estate throughout Savannah, including the land where Whitmore Academy once stood. They've been fighting historic preservation efforts for years, claiming they want to develop the property for commercial use." Dr. Rutherford leaned forward. "Because they know what's buried there. They've been protecting the family secret for generations." Santos's phone rang, interrupting their conversation. She answered with a crisp, "Santos," then listened for several minutes, her expression growing increasingly grim. When she hung up, she looked at the 3 civilians with concern. "That was my captain. Judge Morrison's office called this morning, claiming that the evidence you discovered was stolen from a private family collection. They're demanding its immediate return and threatening legal action against anyone involved in what they're calling grave robbing and theft of family heirlooms." Margaret stood up angrily. "Family heirlooms? Those are the remains of murdered children. I know that, and you know that, but the Morrison family has considerable legal resources and political influence. My captain wants me to proceed very carefully." Santos gathered the documents into a secure file. "I'm placing everything in evidence lockup while we determine the best way to move forward." Sandra, who had been quietly listening, suddenly spoke up. "Detective Santos, there's something else you should know. Since word of the discovery leaked out, I've received several threatening phone calls at the library. Someone doesn't want this story to become public." Before Santos could respond, her desk phone rang again. This time, her conversation was brief and tense. When she hung up, her face was pale. "We have a problem. That was the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. They're taking over this case, effective immediately. All evidence is to be transferred to their custody within the hour." Dr. Rutherford stood abruptly. "That's highly irregular for a historical murder case. Someone with serious political connections is trying to bury this investigation." Santos began packing the evidence back into boxes, but she moved slowly, as if reluctant to hand over the materials. "I've seen this before. High-profile families with dark secrets have ways of making problems disappear. Once the GBI takes over, this evidence could vanish into bureaucratic limbo for years." Margaret made a desperate decision. While Santos was distracted by another phone call, she quietly slipped Elena Chen's journal into her purse. If the official investigation was going to be suppressed, she needed to preserve at least some evidence of the truth. As GBI agents arrived to collect the materials, Detective Santos pulled Margaret aside. I want to help these children get justice, but I have to work within the system. Be careful who you trust. The Morrison family has had over a century to establish connections and eliminate threats. Margaret left the police station feeling frustrated and angry. The children had finally been found. Their story had been revealed, but powerful forces were already working to cover up the truth once again. Elena Chen had died trying to expose Morrison's crimes, and it seemed that history was repeating itself. That evening, Margaret sat in her cottage reading Elena's journal by lamplight. The young teacher's words painted a picture of growing horror as she discovered the full extent of Morrison's activities. But the final entries revealed something even more disturbing. Elena had uncovered evidence that Morrison wasn't working alone. I have discovered correspondence between Dr. Morrison and colleagues at prestigious medical institutions throughout the country, Elena had written. They refer to something called the Advancement Society, a group of physicians conducting similar experiments on children in multiple cities. Morrison's work in Savannah was part of a larger network of medical horrors. Margaret's blood ran cold as she read further. Elena had found evidence that the Advancement Society had members in Atlanta, Charleston, Richmond, and as far north as Baltimore. Children had been disappearing from schools and orphanages throughout the South, all connected to respected physicians who shared Morrison's twisted philosophy. The society believes that by studying the removal of sensory organs from living subjects, they can unlock the secrets of human consciousness, Elena wrote. They consider children to be ideal subjects because their minds are uncorrupted by adult conditioning. Dr. Morrison boasts that his techniques have been adopted by colleagues who are achieving even more remarkable results. Margaret realized that the Morrison family wasn't just protecting the secret of 3 murdered children. They were guarding evidence of a nationwide conspiracy that might have claimed hundreds of victims. The stakes were far higher than she had imagined, and the forces arrayed against her were more powerful and ruthless than she had ever faced. As thunder rumbled overhead and rain began pattering against her windows, Margaret heard the familiar sound of children's laughter echoing through her cottage. But this time, it wasn't Sarah, Thomas, and Mary. These were different voices, dozens of them, coming from all directions, as if a playground full of children was surrounding her home. The spirits of the Advancement Society's other victims had found her, drawn by the exposure of Morrison's crimes. They were all waiting for justice, and they expected Margaret to be their voice. The weight of their expectations settled on her shoulders like a shroud, and she realized that her fight was just beginning. Margaret woke to find her cottage filled with the sound of children's voices. Not laughter this time, but urgent whispers that seemed to come from every corner of every room. She stumbled through the hallway in her nightgown, following the ethereal chorus to her living room, where she stopped in shock. Dozens of translucent figures filled the space, children of various ages, dressed in clothing from different decades, spanning the late 1800s through the early 1900s. They stood in small groups, their faces turned toward Margaret with expressions of desperate hope. Unlike Sarah, Thomas, and Mary, these spirits still had their eyes, but they bore other horrific mutilations, missing limbs, surgical scars, and wounds that spoke of unimaginable suffering. "They're all victims of the Advancement Society," Margaret whispered, understanding flooding through her. "You're all trying to tell your stories." A girl who couldn't have been more than 8 years old stepped forward. She wore a simple dress that marked her as coming from a working-class family, and her left arm ended in a bandaged stump. When she spoke, her voice carried the accent of rural Georgia. "Miss Margaret, we've been waiting so long for someone to listen. The bad doctors hurt us too, just like they hurt Sarah and Thomas and little Mary. But nobody ever looked for us because we weren't from fancy families." An older boy, perhaps 12, moved to stand beside her. His head was wrapped in surgical bandages that hadn't prevented dark stains from seeping through. "They took pieces of our brains, miss. Said they were studying how children think different from grown-ups. Most of us died on their tables, but some lived long enough to know what they'd done to us." Margaret sank into her armchair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of suffering represented in her living room. "How many of you are there?" "Hundreds," replied a girl whose Victorian dress marked her as coming from a more prosperous family. The society had members in 12 cities. They shared their techniques and their results. Atlanta alone had 67 children disappear between 1895 and 1905. A knock at Margaret's front door interrupted the supernatural gathering. Through the window, she could see a small elderly woman with wild grey hair standing on her porch despite the early morning hour. The spirits immediately began to fade, but their leader, The girl with the missing arm turned back to Margaret with urgency. "That's Rosa Santos. She's been trying to help us for years. She can see us, hear us, but nobody believes her. Maybe together you two can do what Elena couldn't." Margaret wrapped a robe around herself and opened the door to find Rosa Santos, a woman she recognized from around the neighborhood but had never met. Rosa was known throughout Savannah as an eccentric psychic medium who read tarot cards and conducted seances for tourists in the historic district. "Margaret Chen," Rosa said without preamble, her voice carrying a slight Spanish accent. "I felt them gathering here. The children of the Advancement Society have been reaching out to me for decades, but I've never had anyone who could help them find justice." Margaret stepped aside to let Rosa enter. "You know about the society. I know more than I wish I did." Rosa moved into the living room where the spirits had been standing moments before. "My grandmother was a nurse in Atlanta in 1902. She worked for Dr. Jonathan Whitfield, one of Morrison's colleagues. She witnessed things that haunted her until the day she died." Rosa sat heavily in Margaret's chair, her aged hands trembling as she spoke. "Grandmother told me about children being brought to Dr. Whitfield's private clinic in the middle of the night. Poor children, orphans, runaways, nobody who would be missed. She tried to help them, tried to stop what was happening, but Dr. Whitfield had her committed to an asylum when she threatened to go to the authorities." Margaret poured Rosa a cup of coffee, her mind racing. "Your grandmother was institutionalized for trying to expose the truth for 3 years, until Dr. Whitfield died in a carriage accident in 1905. Even then, she never fully recovered from what she'd seen. She spent the rest of her life trying to communicate with the spirits of the children, begging their forgiveness for not being able to save them." Rosa pulled a worn leather journal from her large handbag. "This belonged to my grandmother. She recorded everything she remembered about the society's activities. Names, dates, locations, methods. It's all here, written in Spanish to avoid detection." Margaret opened the journal, struggling to read the faded handwriting. Even with her limited Spanish, she could make out enough to understand the horrific scope of the conspiracy. The Advancement Society had operated like a sophisticated medical network, sharing research techniques and even subjects between member institutions. Dr. Morrison in Savannah specialized in ocular experiments, Rosa explained. Dr. Whitfield in Atlanta focused on neurological procedures. There was Dr. Pemberton in Charleston, who studied cardiovascular responses to trauma, and Dr. Blackwood in Richmond, who concentrated on pain tolerance in pediatric subjects. Margaret looked up sharply. "Blackwood? As in Sarah Blackwood?" Rosa nodded grimly. "Sarah's father was Dr. Edmund Blackwood, one of the Society's founding members. He allowed Morrison to experiment on his own daughter in exchange for access to Morrison's research data." The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. Sarah's own father had traded her life for scientific knowledge. The betrayal was even more profound than she had imagined. "The Society disbanded after 1905, Rosa continued. "Too many questions were being asked. Too many witnesses were becoming problems. But the families involved used their wealth and influence to bury the evidence and protect their reputations. They've been passing down the secret from generation to generation, along with instructions to suppress any investigation that might expose the truth." Margaret thought about Judge Morrison's swift intervention in the police investigation. "They're still protecting themselves. And they'll kill to keep doing it," Rosa said bluntly. 3 people have died in the past 30 years while investigating Advancement Society activities. The authorities called them accidents or suicides, but I know better. The families have too much to lose to let the truth come out." As if summoned by Rosa's words, the child spirits began to reappear, surrounding the 2 women with their silent presence. The girl with the missing arm approached Rosa and spoke in a voice that only the medium could hear. Rosa's face went pale as she listened to the spirit's message. "She says the Morrison family knows you have Elena's journal. They're planning to deal with you the same way they dealt with Elena, a mysterious illness that will progress quickly and leave no trace of foul play." Margaret felt fear crawling up her spine. "What are you talking about?" "Elena Chen didn't die of consumption," Rosa said quietly. "She was poisoned slowly over several months, with a combination of arsenic and mercury. Dr. Morrison treated her illness personally, ensuring that each dose brought her closer to death while appearing to help her." The realization that she might be walking into the same trap that killed her ancestor made Margaret's knees weak. But looking at the spirits of all those murdered children, she knew she couldn't abandon their quest for justice. "What do we do?" Margaret asked. Rosa smiled grimly. "We fight back. But first, we need allies. people the Morrison family can't touch or intimidate. I know someone who can help us, but you're not going to like what I'm about to suggest." As thunder rolled across Savannah and the spirits of murdered children watched with desperate hope, Rosa Santos began to outline a plan that would require Margaret to risk everything in a final confrontation with forces that had been killing to protect their secrets for over a century. Rosa Santos's plan was audacious and dangerous: expose the Advancement Society's crimes through the media before the Morrison family could silence them permanently. Her contact was Rebecca Martinez, an investigative journalist with the Atlanta Constitution who specialized in historical exposés and had a reputation for taking on powerful families with dark secrets. Rebecca's been investigating disappearances of children from Atlanta's orphanages in the early 1900s for the past 2 years, Rosa explained, as they drove through downtown Savannah toward their meeting point. She's already uncovered evidence of Dr. Whitfield's activities, but she needs documentation to connect him to the larger conspiracy. Margaret clutched Elena's journal in her lap, along with photographs Rosa had brought from her grandmother's collection. The images were horrific: children on surgical tables, preserved organs in glass jars, and group photographs of distinguished men in medical coats standing over their victims like hunters posing with their prey. They met Rebecca Martinez at the Griffin Tea Room, a neutral location where the journalist could blend in among the tourists and locals enjoying afternoon tea. Rebecca was a woman in her 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and an aura of barely contained energy. She had already secured a corner table away from other patrons. "Rosa told me you've uncovered evidence related to the Advancement Society," Rebecca said without preamble as they sat down. "I have to warn you, this story has been career suicide for every journalist who's tried to tell it. 3 reporters have died under suspicious circumstances while investigating society activities." Margaret spread Elena's journal across the table. "Then maybe it's time someone finally succeeded." Rebecca's eyes widened as she examined the documents. Her professional composure cracked as she read Morrison's surgical notes and studied the photographs. "Dear God, this is even worse than what I uncovered in Atlanta. You have Morrison's complete records?" "Everything Elena Chen managed to preserve," Margaret confirmed, including correspondence between Morrison and other society members discussing their research and sharing techniques. Rebecca pulled out a digital recorder and a notebook. "I need to hear the complete story. Start from the beginning and don't leave out any details." For the next hour, Margaret recounted everything, discovering the photograph, meeting the children's spirits, finding Elena's hidden chamber, and learning about the nationwide conspiracy. Rebecca listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions and taking careful notes. "The political connections are the key," Rebecca said when Margaret finished. "Judge Morrison, Dr. Richard Morrison, and their foundation have donated millions to political campaigns over the years. They have governors, senators, and federal judges in their pocket. That's why the official investigation was shut down so quickly." Rosa leaned forward. "But if we can get the story published before they can stop it, if we can show the public what really happened, the families will have to respond," Rebecca finished. "They can't suppress a story that's already in the public domain, especially one with this level of documentation." She looked at Margaret seriously. "But once this breaks, you'll be in serious danger. These families have killed to protect their secrets for over a century." Margaret thought about the spirits of hundreds of murdered children who had appeared in her living room. "Those children have been waiting for justice for more than 100 years. I won't abandon them now." Rebecca nodded with respect. "I'll need copies of everything. My editor will want independent verification, but with this level of documentation, we can have the story ready for publication within 48 hours. I suggest you both leave Savannah until it breaks. The Morrison family will move fast once they realize what's happening." As they prepared to leave the tea room, Margaret noticed a well-dressed man at a nearby table who had been pretending to read a newspaper while clearly listening to their conversation. When their eyes met, he quickly looked away, but not before Margaret recognized him from a photograph in Elena's journal. Dr. Richard Morrison, descendant of the monster who had tortured children in the name of science. "We need to go," Margaret whispered urgently. "Now!" Rebecca followed Margaret's gaze and cursed under her breath. "He's probably been following you." "How long has he been there?" They gathered their materials quickly and left through the tea room's rear exit, but Margaret could feel eyes watching them from the shadows. As they reached Rosa's car, Margaret's phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number, but she answered anyway. "Ms. Chen," a cultured voice said, This is Judge William Morrison. I believe you have something that belongs to my family. Margaret's blood ran cold. I don't know what you're talking about. Please don't insult my intelligence. You have documents that were stolen from private family collections, and you've been spreading malicious lies about respected members of the Savannah community. I'm prepared to offer you a substantial sum for the return of those materials, along with a written agreement to cease your harassment of my family. Harassment? Margaret's voice rose in anger. Your great-great-grandfather murdered children. Doctor. Aldrich Morrison was a respected physician who dedicated his life to advancing medical science. The wild accusations you're making are based on forged documents and the fantasies of disturbed individuals. Judge Morrison's tone remained calm, but Margaret detected an underlying threat. I strongly advise you to accept my generous offer, Ms. Chen. The alternative would be unfortunate. Margaret ended the call and looked at Rosa and Rebecca with fear and determination warring in her expression. They know everything we're doing. We're running out of time. Rebecca started her car and pulled into traffic. My editor can expedite the story if necessary. We can have it published online within 12 hours if we work through the night. As they drove through Savannah's historic district, Margaret noticed that they were being followed by a black sedan with tinted windows. The car stayed exactly 3 vehicles behind them, matching their turns and speed with professional precision. They're not even trying to hide it, Rosa observed, watching the sedan in the side mirror. They want us to know we're being watched. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Last chance, $1 million for the documents. Otherwise, you'll suffer the same mysterious illness that claimed Elena Chen. The threat was explicit now. The Morrison family was prepared to kill her, just as they had killed Elena over a century ago. But Margaret also realized that their desperation meant they were vulnerable. For the first time in over 100 years, the secret they had killed to protect was on the verge of being exposed. Drive to the newspaper office, Margaret told Rebecca. If we're going to do this, we need to do it now before they can stop us. As they raced through Savannah's streets with the black sedan following behind them, Margaret felt the presence of the murdered children riding with them. Hundreds of spirits who had waited more than a century for someone brave enough to tell their story. The final confrontation with the Advancement Society's legacy was about to begin. Thunder rumbled overhead as storm clouds gathered above the city, and Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that the weather was responding to the supernatural forces that had been awakened by her investigation. The children wanted justice, and they wouldn't rest until the truth was finally revealed. The Atlanta Constitution's newsroom buzzed with late-night energy as Rebecca Martinez worked frantically to prepare her exposé. Margaret and Rosa sat at a conference table surrounded by laptops, documents, and multiple phones as the journalists' team scrambled to verify sources and prepare the story for immediate publication. Legal wants independent confirmation of the medical records, Rebecca called out from her desk. I've got a forensic document expert examining Elena's journal, and our medical consultant is reviewing Morrison's surgical notes. Margaret checked her watch. 11:47 p.m. They had been working for 6 hours straight, and the black sedan that had followed them from Savannah was still parked across the street from the newspaper building. The Morrison family wasn't even pretending to hide their surveillance anymore. The carbon dating results from the library discovery should be enough to authenticate the timeline, Dr. Rutherford said through the speakerphone. He had driven to Atlanta to provide historical context and was now consulting with the newspaper's research team. I've also contacted colleagues at other universities who can verify the existence of the Advancement Society through their own archives. Rosa suddenly stiffened in her chair, her eyes rolling back as she went into what Margaret had learned was a mediumistic trance. The old woman's voice became distant and ethereal. They're coming. The families have gathered. They mean to end this tonight, no matter the cost. Margaret felt a chill of supernatural cold sweep through the newsroom. Looking around, she could see the faint outlines of child spirits beginning to materialize throughout the office, dozens of them, standing silently among the desks and workstations. Rebecca's editor, James Patterson, emerged from his office with a grim expression. I just got off the phone with our publisher. Judge Morrison called him directly, threatening lawsuits and political retaliation if we print this story. He claims the documents are fabricated and that we're participating in a criminal conspiracy. What did the publisher say? Rebecca asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. He wants us to hold the story pending further investigation, Patterson replied. Morrison's legal team is filing injunctions in 3 different courts to prevent publication. They're moving fast and using every connection they have. Margaret stood up angrily. They're doing exactly what they did to Elena Chen, using their power and influence to suppress the truth. There's more, Patterson continued. 20 minutes ago, someone broke into the Georgia Historical Society and stole all the files related to Whitmore Academy. The security guards were found unconscious, and there's no record of who accessed the building. Doubted. Rutherford's voice crackled through the speaker with alarm. That's impossible. Those files were in a secure archive with multiple locks and surveillance systems. Rebecca was already pulling up news feeds on her laptop. It gets worse. There's been a fire at the Carnegie Library in Savannah. The basement levels where you found Elena's chamber have been completely destroyed. The fire department is calling it an electrical malfunction, but the timing is suspicious. Margaret felt her heart sink. The Morrison family was systematically destroying evidence, using their resources to erase any trace of their ancestors' crimes. Elena's carefully preserved chamber, the children's remains, the medical instruments, all of it was gone. They can't destroy everything, Rosa said, emerging from her trance. The spirits are telling me that Elena hid additional evidence in multiple locations. She knew the Morrison family would try to cover up the truth. Margaret pulled out her phone and dialed Detective Santos in Savannah. The call went straight to voicemail, which was unusual for the dedicated detective. She tried the police station's main number. Savannah PD, this is Officer Davis. This is Margaret Chen. I need to speak with Detective Santos about the Whitmore Academy case. There was a long pause before Officer Davis responded. Ma'am, Detective Santos is currently on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. All inquiries regarding ongoing cases need to be directed to Detective Morrison. Margaret's blood turned to ice. Detective Morrison? Is he related to Judge Morrison? Detective Richard Morrison is Judge Morrison's son. Is there something I can help you with? Margaret hung up without responding. The Morrison family had infiltrated even the police investigation, placing their own family member in charge of suppressing evidence. They've thought of everything, Margaret said to the room. They have people in the police department, the courts, the media. How do we fight that level of corruption? Rebecca was typing furiously on her laptop. We don't fight them through traditional channels. We bypass them entirely. She looked up with fierce determination. I'm posting the story directly to our website and social media platforms. Once it's online, they can't suppress it. Patterson shook his head. Rebecca, if you publish without authorization, you'll be fired and probably sued into bankruptcy. Some stories are more important than careers, Rebecca replied, continuing to type. Those children deserve justice, and I won't let powerful families bury the truth again. As Rebecca worked, Margaret noticed that the child spirits were becoming more solid and visible. They stood in a protective circle around the journalist, their translucent forms flickering with ethereal light. The girl with the missing arm approached Margaret and spoke in a voice that everyone in the room could now hear. The bad families are coming here tonight. They bring poison and fire and death, but we are stronger now. The truth gives us power. Through the newsroom windows, Margaret could see additional black sedans arriving on the street below. Men in expensive suits were getting out of the vehicles, moving with the purposeful coordination of people accustomed to cleaning up messy situations. How long until the story is published? Margaret asked urgently. 10 minutes for the basic article, Rebecca replied without looking up from her screen. 20 minutes for the full exposé with all the documentation. Rosa stood and moved to the windows, her elderly frame suddenly radiating supernatural energy. The children are calling their friends. Every victim of the Advancement Society is coming to protect us. Margaret looked outside and gasped. The street below was filling with translucent figures, hundreds of child spirits from multiple cities and decades, all converging on the newspaper building. They moved with silent purpose, forming ranks between the Morrison family's enforcers and the building entrance. The men in suits stopped abruptly as they encountered the supernatural barrier. Margaret could see them drawing weapons, but the spirits simply stood their ground, their collective presence creating a wall of otherworldly protection. 5 minutes, Rebecca announced. The story is uploading now. As thunder crashed overhead and supernatural forces gathered in the streets of Atlanta, Margaret realized that the century-old battle between truth and corruption was finally reaching its climax. The children who had suffered and died at the hands of the Advancement Society were making their final stand, using powers beyond the physical world to ensure that their stories would finally be told. But the Morrison family had proven they would kill to protect their secrets, and Margaret knew that even supernatural protection might not be enough to save them from the violence that was coming. The power went out, just as Rebecca's finger hovered over the publish button. Emergency lighting flickered on, casting eerie shadows throughout the newsroom as the building's backup generators struggled to maintain minimal electricity. Outside, the streetlights had also failed, plunging downtown Atlanta into an unnatural darkness, broken only by the ethereal glow of hundreds of child spirits. "They cut the main power lines," Patterson said, checking his phone. "The internet connection is down too. They're trying to prevent us from publishing." Margaret looked out the window and saw men in suits working at a utility box across the street, while others approached the building's entrance. But the child spirits weren't passive observers anymore. They were actively interfering with the Morrison family's operations. Tools fell from the men's hands without explanation, equipment malfunctioned when touched, and several of the enforcers stumbled backward as if pushed by invisible forces. "The children are fighting back," Rosa said with wonder in her voice. "They're using their spiritual energy to protect us." Rebecca was frantically trying to restore her internet connection. "I need 30 seconds of connectivity to upload the story, that's all." Dr. Rutherford's voice crackled through a battery-powered radio they had found in the newsroom. "Margaret, I'm at the University of Georgia archives. I found Elena's backup documentation. She hid copies of everything in the university library's rare book collection. Even if they destroy the originals, the evidence still exists." Through the building's stairwell, Margaret could hear footsteps echoing upward. The Morrison family's people had gained entry and were making their way to the newsroom. She estimated they had perhaps 2 minutes before the confrontation turned violent. "There has to be another way to get online," Margaret said desperately. Rosa pulled out an old smartphone. "I have a mobile hotspot. The signal is weak, but it might work." Rebecca quickly connected her laptop to Rosa's phone and began uploading the story again. The progress bar crawled forward, agonizingly slowly. 15%, 23%, 31%. The newsroom door burst open, and Judge William Morrison strode in, flanked by 6 men in expensive suits. The judge was tall and distinguished, with silver hair and cold blue eyes that radiated the arrogance of someone accustomed to getting his way. His companions carried briefcases that Margaret suspected contained more than legal documents. "Miss Chen," Judge Morrison said with false courtesy, "I had hoped we could resolve this matter without unpleasantness. You forced me to take more direct action." Margaret stood to face him, drawing strength from the presence of the child spirits that filled the room. Sarah, Thomas, and little Mary stood directly behind her, their eyeless sockets fixed on the descendant of their killer. "Your family's reign of terror ends tonight," Margaret replied. "The truth is coming out whether you like it or not." Judge Morrison's composure cracked slightly as he looked around the newsroom. Even though he couldn't see the spirits clearly, he could feel their presence. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees, and frost was forming on the windows despite the warm Georgia night. "You're meddling with forces you don't understand," Morrison said. "My family has protected this city's reputation for over a century. We've donated millions to charities, funded hospitals, supported education. Would you destroy all that good work for the sake of ancient history?" "Ancient history?" Margaret's voice rose with anger. "Your ancestor tortured and murdered children." "Dr. Aldrich Morrison was a pioneer in medical research," Judge Morrison replied coldly. "His work contributed to advances that have saved thousands of lives. Sometimes progress requires sacrifice." Rebecca's laptop showed 67% uploaded. She kept typing while pretending to be cowering behind her desk. One of Morrison's men stepped forward, reaching inside his jacket. "Judge, we need to end this conversation." Before he could draw his weapon, the man was lifted off his feet by an invisible force and thrown against the wall with bone-crushing impact. The other enforcers drew guns, but their weapons jammed or misfired as spiritual energy interfered with the mechanical components. Rosa stood in the center of the room, her arms raised and her eyes glowing with otherworldly power. "You cannot win this fight, Morrison. The children you family murdered have been waiting over a century for justice. Their rage gives them strength beyond your comprehension." Judge Morrison pulled out his own gun, a nickel-plated revolver that had belonged to his ancestor. "This weapon killed Elena Chen," he said with vicious satisfaction. "Dr. Morrison used it to silence her when poison proved too slow. How fitting that it should end this family's interference once and for all." As Morrison raised the gun toward Margaret, little Mary stepped between them. The child spirit's form became solid and radiant, her missing eyes replaced by points of brilliant white light. When she spoke, her voice carried the power of every murdered child. "You will not hurt her. You will not silence the truth. We are done hiding in the shadows. Judge Morrison fired the gun directly at Margaret, but the bullet passed harmlessly through little Mary's spirit form and embedded itself in the wall behind them. The spirit child reached out and touched Morrison's hand with fingers that burned like ice. Morrison screamed and dropped the weapon. His hand blackened with supernatural frostbite. Around the room, his remaining men were being systematically overwhelmed by the child spirits who had abandoned their passive observation for active protection of the living. Rebecca's laptop chimed, "Upload complete. Story published." Within seconds, phones throughout the newsroom began buzzing with notifications as the story spread across social media platforms. The headline, "The Advancement Society, A Century of Medical Murder Exposed," was accompanied by Elena Chen's photographs and Morrison's own surgical notes. Judge Morrison stared at the screens in horror as his family's darkest secret spread beyond his ability to contain it. "You have no idea what you've done," he whispered. "There are forces beyond my family, organizations that have protected the Advancement Society's legacy for generations. They won't let this stand." Margaret felt a moment of triumph, but it was tempered by Morrison's ominous warning. "What organizations?" Before Morrison could answer, the child spirits began to fade as their purpose was finally fulfilled. Sarah, Thomas, and little Mary approached Margaret one last time. "Thank you," Sarah said, her voice filled with peace at last. "Elena's sacrifice was not in vain. The truth will set us all free." As the spirits disappeared into whatever realm awaited them, Margaret realized that while they had won this battle, the war might be far from over. The Advancement Society had operated with the support of powerful institutions for over a century, and those forces would not surrender easily. But for now the children could rest. Their stories had been told, their suffering acknowledged, and their killers exposed to the judgment of history. Justice, delayed for more than 100 years, had finally begun. 6 months after Rebecca Martinez's expose rocked the nation, Margaret Chen stood in Savannah's newly dedicated memorial garden for the victims of the Advancement Society. The plot of land where Whitmore Academy once stood had been transformed into a peaceful sanctuary with marble monuments bearing the names of every child who had suffered at the hands of the medical conspiracy. The investigation that followed the publication of Elena's evidence had uncovered the full scope of the Society's crimes. Federal authorities, working with international partners, had identified over 300 child victims across 12 cities. The conspiracy had reached into some of America's most prestigious medical institutions, resulting in criminal charges against living descendants who had covered up the crimes and civil suits that bankrupted several prominent families. Judge William Morrison sat in federal prison awaiting trial on charges of witness intimidation, destruction of evidence, and conspiracy to commit murder. His son, Detective Richard Morrison, had been arrested for tampering with evidence and obstruction of justice. The Morrison Medical Foundation had been dissolved, its assets redistributed to organizations supporting child welfare and medical ethics. Dr. James Rutherford approached Margaret as she placed fresh flowers at the memorial dedicated to Sarah Blackwood, Thomas Henley, and Mary Morrison. The historian looked older, but more at peace than she had ever seen him. "The university has approved the Elena Chen archive," he told Margaret. "Her documents and your investigation will be preserved for future researchers studying medical ethics and historical justice." Margaret nodded, touched by the honor. Elena would be proud that her sacrifice finally meant something. Rosa Santos joined them, moving slowly but with obvious satisfaction. The elderly medium had become something of a celebrity after the story broke, consulted by law enforcement agencies investigating cold cases involving missing children. "I haven't sensed any restless spirits in weeks," Rosa said with a peaceful smile. "The children have all moved on. They found the justice they were seeking." Rebecca Martinez arrived carrying copies of her new book, The Advancement Society, How Medical Monsters Hid Among America's Elite. The investigative journalist had won a Pulitzer Prize for her expose and had used her newfound platform to advocate for transparency in medical research and protection of vulnerable subjects. "The documentary premieres next month," Rebecca told the group. "It includes interviews with descendants of the victims and archival footage we discovered in university collections. The story is reaching audiences around the world." Margaret walked to the center of the memorial garden where a fountain had been installed. The sound of flowing water created a peaceful atmosphere that seemed to wash away the darkness that had haunted this place for over a century. Engraved on the fountain's base were Elena Chen's words, "Truth delayed is not truth denied." Justice may sleep, but it never dies. Dr. Sandra Westbrook approached from the direction of the rebuilt Carnegie Library. The head librarian had testified before Congress about the importance of preserving historical evidence and had been instrumental in establishing new protocols for protecting archived materials. The library's memorial exhibition opened this morning, Sandra reported. We're displaying Elena's original journal alongside artifacts recovered from the sealed chamber. Thousands of people have already visited to pay their respects. As the group stood together in the memorial garden, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. What had begun with a disturbing photograph found at an estate sale had evolved into a quest for justice that spanned multiple states and more than a century of hidden crimes. The legal aftermath continued to unfold. Federal prosecutors had filed charges against living members of several prominent families who had knowingly concealed evidence of their ancestors' crimes. Medical schools across the country were reviewing their historical records and establishing new ethics committees to prevent similar atrocities. Legislation had been introduced in Congress to provide compensation for the descendants of known victims. But perhaps most importantly, the children's stories had been heard. Museums and schools were incorporating the history of the Advancement Society into their curricula, ensuring that future generations would understand the importance of protecting vulnerable subjects in medical research. Margaret's antique shop had closed permanently. She no longer needed to make a living from the past when she was helping to reshape the future. She had accepted a position with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, using her research skills to investigate cold cases and help other families find closure. As evening approached and Spanish moss swayed gently in the warm Savannah breeze, Margaret made her way to Elena Chen's restored grave in Laurel Grove Cemetery. The simple headstone had been replaced with an elaborate monument honoring Elena's courage and sacrifice. Fresh flowers appeared at the grave daily, left by strangers who had been moved by her story. "Thank you," Margaret whispered to her ancestor's memory. "You never gave up, even when it cost you everything. The children are finally at peace." A gentle breeze stirred the flowers on Elena's grave, and for just a moment, Margaret could have sworn she heard the distant sound of children's laughter, not the haunted voices of the past, but the joyful sounds of spirits finally free to play in whatever realm awaited them. Walking back through Savannah's historic district as the sun set over the Savannah River, Margaret felt a profound sense of completion. The photograph that had started everything sat framed in her home, but now it showed only an empty schoolyard with sunlight streaming through ancient oak trees. The children were gone. Their long vigil finally ended. The city's evening chorus of church bells began to ring across the historic district, their bronze voices carrying messages of remembrance and hope into the gathering darkness. Savannah would always carry the scars of its past, but those wounds had finally been acknowledged and could begin to heal. In the growing twilight, Margaret Chen walked home through streets where the spirits of murdered children no longer wandered in search of justice. Their stories had been told, their suffering acknowledged, and their truth preserved for all time. After more than a century of darkness, the light of justice had finally illuminated the shadows where evil had once thrived. The three smiling children of the 1901 photograph had found their peace at last, and with them, the hundreds of other young victims whose voices had been silenced by wealth and power. Their legacy would live on not in the darkness of forgotten graves, but in the light of truth that would protect future generations from similar horrors. Justice, delayed but not denied, had finally come to Savannah.